What is power? And how is it developed? And how do we distinguish power from force and coercion? Hi, and greetings of peace to all of you. I am Louay Safi, and this is the second talk of the series on truth and power. I will first introduce two conceptions of power: power as the will of the strong, and power as the will of the free. And then I will move on to look into a few examples to illustrate these two conceptions of power. We often confuse power with force in our day-to-day experience. Power is frequently confused with the ability to compel others to do what we want them to do, and not necessarily with what is in their best interests. But the concept of power is not synonymous with force. To the contrary, people begin to lose their power when force instead of persuasion and cooperation is their first instinct, their first mode of action, or when they only consider their own interests and overlook the interests and dignity of other human beings. Let us begin by exploring how power is conceived by influential thinkers. I would like first to look into the definition provided by the 20th century political scientist Robert Dahl, and here is the definition as he offers it. You can see here that Dahl identifies power with the ability to make people do something they would not otherwise do. We usually encounter this kind of power and power relations in established hierarchies, such as military, business, or governmental organizations. This definition focuses on the coercive aspects of power, which reflects an example of how power reveals itself in a hierarchical order. And of course, the worst example of hierarchical orders would be the authoritarian state. This definition seems to shed light on the negative aspects of power, on hard power, and overlooks the most important aspect in which power was used to promote shared interests and values. Dahl is not alone really in conceiving power this way. This conception of power is rooted in realpolitik, in the 19th century realpolitik, in political realism, which places power at the center of the human interests and concerns itself with the promotion of self-interest, while denying any connection between power and moral values, or, if you will, the principles of truth. This modern obsession with power is best represented in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who authored several books on this topic, including The Will to Power, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche, in his work, presents a notion of power that's focusing on self-discipline and the pursuit of dominance and supremacy. The key terms in Nietzsche's philosophy are the will to power and the order of rank. Here is a glimpse of how Nietzsche thinks about power and what does he mean when he says the will to power. So he's basically saying that, well, power is the most important thing, and then morality, good and evil, are illusions that we have to overcome. So by the will to power, he means the inclination people have to dominate others, while the order of rank is, let me show you here a glimpse of, again, what Nietzsche means by the order of rank. So for him, the order of rank is none other than promoting social hierarchy, really. Um, Dominance and social hierarchy became later the creed of the Nazi Party in Germany that led the German people to World War II and to an appalling human disaster. Now, of course, the writings of Nietzsche really have a lot of nuances, and he could be read a completely different way than what we saw during the Nazi time. But a superficial and reading of his writings, which are, as I said, sophisticated, would really render those concepts become the most prominent in what he says, the will to power and the order of rank, which means that people are not equal, they have to be ranked in terms of priorities. So some of them are better than others. One of the most interesting take on power was provided by Michel Foucault, a renowned postmodernist. Foucault believes that power is diffused throughout society and cannot be pinned down to any particular individual or institution. He argued that power ultimately can be found in the discourse that creates a particular meaning in a specific social and cultural group. But the truth Foucault talks about is an illusion. It is an elusive truth, and it is unhinged truth bordering on chaos, because it's completely given to relativism. There is no transcendental principles that we could find to identify a moral truth, at least. And similarly, Foucault doesn't believe that there's any universal principle that can be shared by the entire human society. Truth for him does not have universal and transcendental elements, but is rather relative to a particular individual or a particular social group. And that's really an interesting way, the way that postmodernists moved away from modern philosophy, because postmodernists take the opposite end of the European modernists, who tend to be Eurocentric, who sees that the very European values and views are universal to the entire humanity. Here we have the opposite, where we have the second generation, the postmodernist, rejecting completely the modernist views and taking the opposite views. Let us now look at the notion of power through its social manifestation, through the way we see it usually around us in the political and social realms. The first step to understand the source of power is to realize that power develops over time. Nobody can have power immediately. Power is not attached to a particular office or to a particular institution. It is rather this time-bound process of accumulation and of development. It takes considerable time for power to manifest itself, whether we are talking about individual power or collective power. The individual must focus on their vision and maintain self-discipline for a long time before their power matures and becomes visible. Similarly, a society must pursue its vision of a better self over generations before its power becomes recognizable. I'm not going to go into historical argument and philosophical argument on these points, but something that can be illustrated by viewing how individual character develops and how societies move from a level of interaction that is still pre-civilizational into a full-fledged civilization. If power is not given by but grow over time, it must then lies in the spirit and act of leadership. Power is about leading individuals and leading societies. And by leadership here is, I'm not referring to any position, but certain attitudes and characteristics that really define power. And so let me share with you the slide to introduce an alternative notion of power. I will discuss leadership in more details in subsequent videos, but for now, I will use the term here to indicate a person with a creative vision and and a conviction. So leadership, the way I'm using it here, refers to a creative vision of the future with conviction, competence, and compassion. So these are really elements to very necessary for the notion of power, at least power as a process in which the individual and society grew from a lesser state to more advanced and developed state. A powerful person is a leading personality who attracts following by his moral discipline and creative ideas. A powerful nation, likewise, is a leading society distinguished by its social solidarity and its ability to develop fair and efficient institutions of governance, learning, and justice. So here are some key concepts that associated with power in the above definition that I just alluded to. These will include notions like character, moral discipline, creative ideas, solidarity, fairness, efficiency, and institutions. Now, these can, of course, be reduced to more specific elements that are at the core of all these different manifestations of power. The grounds of power in the individual, we have to say they are moral discipline and creative ideas. In society, social solidarity, rule of law, and creative and ethical leadership. Of course, social solidarity is not like a given. It is something that's acquired, and it requires a moral foundation for people within a particular society so that they can subordinate their own individual desires and will for a common vision that will benefit everybody. This is basically what we mean when we talk about powerful individuals and powerful societies. We saw so far that power could be conceived in two different ways. It could be conceived as power to dominate and control other human beings and to achieve supremacy over others. But power also can be conceived as the struggle to improve human condition, to improve the lives of people around us, to be inclusive, to seek not only our own interest, but the interest of others. So these are opposing concepts. Of course, in real life, you don't have, this is like ideal types. In reality, you find a mix of these two with varying degrees. Of course, the best examples of individuals and societies are those that strive to be on the side of power as inclusive and as attempting to create a meaningful society with equality, equal dignity, and cooperation. Let us now turn to see some examples that we could use to illustrate these two conceptions of power. And we'll do that both at the level of the individual and the collectivity. With regard to the individual, I think the best examples of this kind of power we find in the persons of the prophets, who and those who walked in their traditions, those who struggled throughout their lives to improve, to uplift the human spirit through their model, their example, and improve the human condition. There are many prophets we can point to. These are individuals who were anchored in transcendence, in transcendental universal principles, and who encourage people around them, as they did themselves, to be socially responsible and to work to limit the excesses of kings and oligarchs. Joseph, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad are examples of individuals who devoted their lives to really improve the conditions around them. Of course, they themselves became victorious in many ways, and those who followed them particularly found more nourishment and improvement by committing themselves to the universal principles that make people worthy of being humans and make life worth living. They were the underdog in relation to those who were opposed them, their opponents, their adversaries. But in the process, the balance of power shifted in their favor. And with their determination and courage, they struggled to make life better for themselves and for other human beings. You may object and say, okay, well, these are examples of prophets whose stories are enshrined in mystical narratives. So that's true. I mean, we know their stories, often through the narratives that have been passed down through their followers and those who followed their path. But history is full of examples of people whose life resemble this rise to power from humble beginnings, including stories of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and of course I used examples from a particular society, but definitely we could find these people all over the world and in different cultures and societies. So on the one hand, leaders who, this is the example of people who improve their lives and life of those around them by sticking to universal principles and moral living and have a creative vision for the future. But we have also examples of people who were quite obsessed with power, with themselves, with sort of advancing their own interests or the interests of people around them, but caring less about those who are at distance. These include persons like Mussolini in Italy, the dictator who brought ruin to his society, or General Pinochet, who ended up losing everything and bringing pain and shame to those who walked in their steps. We could also look at examples of power at the level of society. I would like to stick with one example with regard to people who led their communities to triumph by sticking to the truth and the principles of truth. Again, these are many. They include, of course, the prophetic examples of Moses and of Muhammad, peace be with them, but also would include the example of those who struggle against being subordinated to the whims of monarchs, whether in Europe through the various revolutions and struggle to gain human dignity for all, or throughout the history in societies that rose from a humble beginning but led by wise and principled leaders, like the rise of Islam from Arabia to become a global civilization just a few centuries later, that has an impact on arts, on science, on learning, and on social models. Unfortunately, Germany was dragged into World War II by a leader who was narcissistic, who did not care about other human beings, but he was committed to the order of rank, of social hierarchy, as well as at supremacy and domination. Germany had all the ingredients to become a leading world power. It was the most advanced European society in science, learning, and industry around the mid of the 20th century. Its population was highly disciplined with remarkable work ethic and elevated sense of duty. What it was then lacking is this inclusive and fair understanding of social diversity. It failed then to establish social peace even with the small but thriving Jewish minority that lived with them. By the turn of the 20th century, the rational idealism that was really the gift of German philosophy to the world was really it was the bedrock of humanism, as we could see in the Kantian and Hegelian views. The Kantian optimism about perpetual peace created by people who observed a sense of dignity and equality that extended to the entire humanity. This was abandoned as a romantic philosophy, and Germany embraced instead a philosophy of power, propagated by realpolitik philosophers and leaders. This is the end of the presentation. I hope you found it useful. Please share with me your views, your conception of power. Share with me any critique you have about some of the ideas presented, so I can engage with you and try, hopefully, learn from you, as well as maybe exchange views and try to improve this conception of power. Till next talk, I hope you all do well, and see you later.